Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Everyone Refused to Save the Paralyzed Alien Warrior, Except This Human Soldier HFY sci-fi story. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The storm came in sideways, full of powdered glass and ash that scraped across armor like a million tiny knives. In the copper light of Lornca's twin moons, the ruins looked almost gentle. Distance softened the edges of collapsed towers, and the heat mirages blurred the jagged bones of the broken city. But up close it was all teeth, rebar like fangs, shattered polycrete like serrated plates, and the stink of old fire. There was no birdsong on Lornca, no insects, nothing living that remembered how to sing. Only the wind, the constant, hungry wind. Sergeant Cole Maddox crouched in the lee of a toppled transit pillar and watched the storm crawl across the horizon. The sand there rose in sheets and curled like the backs of ancient beasts. His helmet HUD marked weak radiation flares and residual thermal spikes from things that had died hours ago. Beneath his knee, a beacon blinked a patient blue. One of 7 his unit had dropped in their retreat. All 7 blinked now for no one. Command had pulled the last transports 2 days earlier, declaring the evacuation complete, the objective secured, the theater finished, the world unsuitable for ongoing presence. He should have been on the last shuttle, strapped in with the rest of the survivors as they punched through the gray air into the dark where ships waited. Orders had been clear, but orders did not carry the taste of the voice he'd heard, tinny and fractured and all too alive, cutting through the static between a pair of collapsed towers. It hadn't been human. It had been low and resonant and defiant, a sound too stubborn to die. It had been a single word, a name maybe, flensed by static. T-Ven. He should have ignored it. Lornca had been a Dominion stronghold. Any signal left after the Coalition bombardment was bait or ghost. But Maddox had spent too long on too many ruined worlds to pretend he couldn't hear the difference between a lure and a living thing. He had turned away from the shuttle's wake and gone back into the city. Alone. No fanfare. No drama, not even to himself. His boots crunched glass. The wind pushed at his shoulders. He moved toward the sound not because he thought it wise, but because he couldn't not. It led him into a canyon of wreckage where a Khelt Vanguard exosuit lay on its back like a dead god. Dominion engineers built those frames to wear like mountains. Each plate of armor could stop a shipborne rail slug. Now the mountain was cracked. One leg was buried under a collapsed lane of roadway. The other was simply gone. The suit's power core had vented and fused, then cooled again into metallic obsidian. No one should have survived it. But the visor was spidered, not shattered, and behind that broken glass 2 lambent orange eyes followed him with an awareness that made his own skin crawl. The Khelt's mandibles, short, ridged, more like plates than jaws, flexed slowly. The translator bead lodged in the alien's throat vibrated thin sound. Enemy, it said. The word came wet, frayed, and full of smoke. Human, finish. Maddox lifted his rifle on instinct. It would be so simple, one pulse to the center mass. Melt what remained of the spinal trunk and the problem becomes a corpse. The Coalition briefings had taught him what the Khelt had done across the spiral, colonies erased, prisoners worked to death for shipyards, worlds raked clean to feed war. Every story wore edges of truth. The Khelt were monsters in those stories because monsters needed killing, and because monsters made moral arithmetic easy. He held the rifle a second longer. Then he thumbed the safety back on and slung it over his shoulder. Not today, he said. The Vanguard's eyes did not blink. Perhaps they could not. Why? The bead asked, turning the word into a little shiver of sound. Hate us. Maybe we do. Maddox stepped into the rubble and braced his boots. Maybe it doesn't matter. It took him 2 hours to cut the broken plates off the Khelt's chest with a torch he wasn't supposed to salvage, and another 3 to get the torque locks off the harness and pry the exosuit's torso apart like a clam. The storm had moved by then, and everything lay beneath a dusting of ash like a funeral shroud. He slid his hands under metal that still held the memory of heat and heaved, until tendons in his back sang. The leg came free with a sucking sound that made bile rise in his throat. What was left of the Khelt's lower body slid limply out of the suit with it. The smell did not get less terrible when the air hit it. He had to stop twice to vomit. The Khelt did not mock him. That would come later. Maddox made a travois out of a square of armored plating and the kinked ribs of a transit kiosk, and lashed the Khelt to it with cables pulled from the exosuit's innards. The alien was light only compared to the suit. Even with his powered braces, he ground his teeth and sweated and swore as he dragged his enemy across the broken city to a bunker whose doors had been blown inward, not outward, which meant it had once housed something very valuable and was now very empty. The bunker still held power in a whining skeleton way, enough for blue emergency lights to put a sick color on the walls, enough for the med station to start up, complain in an alien script his helmet couldn't translate yet, and spool its arms like a mechanical spider waking. The station refused him, DNA incompatible / protocol locked, but it looked at the Khelt and opened like a flower. He slid Relaxation inside and stepped back, half expecting the machine to become a cage and a furnace. It did not. It did what he guessed it had been built to do. It infused blue fluid, measured pressure, mapped fractures. It sang to itself in a language of hums and clicks. It stitched what could be stitched and left what could not alone. When it finished, it chimed. He stood very still and felt the absurd urge to applaud. He didn't. He slid the Khelt out, wrapped him in a thermal with the least holes, and set about the business of staying alive long enough to make saving him mean something. He stripped the bunker of anything edible by either species, siphoned power cells to a ceramic kettle that still believed water could boil, and coaxed heat from coils that had forgotten they were ever warm. His helmet died during the second night. He took it off and set it near the fire, and he watched himself reflected in the cracked visor. A human face under a lattice of ash and exhaustion. The eyes of a man who had kept saying yes until he was here, and now there was no one left to tell him no. The Khelt's first lucid words that didn't ask for death came on the 4th cycle when the bunker had fallen into a rhythm of hums that almost felt like breath. The alien's chest rose and fell under the thermal. The broken plates of his mnemonic crown thin filigree that marked the memory lines of a Khelt service caught the low light and gave it back grudgingly. His voice was raw. It pushed through the translator bead as if it hurt. Relaxation, Vanguard Captain, you took my armor, my legs, you left my name. Maddox glanced over from where he was prying apart a stubborn ration block with a multi-tool. The armor took your legs, your name must have held on. You are a soldier. The Khelt's eyes tracked him, patient and alien. Maddox said, and immediately disliked how the word sounded. Rikhal said in a tone that said there was no argument he would respect less. They spoke like that at first, scattered words wrapped in long silences, questions that answered other questions. Maddox learned to touch the edges of their language. The Khelt did not say, I owe you. They said, I carry your weight. They did not say, I thank you. They said, I am seen. When he asked why the Vanguard had stood in the path of the coalition at all, Rikhal tilted his head slightly, a movement that suggested humor and pain. Because we were built to stand, he said. Because our fathers told us the world ends when you kneel. Does it? Maddox asked. Rikhal watched the ceiling until the blue lights flickered, then said, very quietly, sometimes. When Maddox left the bunker, he did so at dawn because dawn was when the ash wind calmed for a span and the storm tracks were readable. He mapped the routes between smashed depots and broken habs in a little book he made of stitched ration box cardboard, because batteries failed and paper did not forget. He taught himself the squeal of raider skids in the distance, and the ghost shimmer that meant a swarm of autonomous microforges were out looking for metal to eat. He learned that the air tasted of copper when the orbital plates shifted and heat bled down through long cracks in the sky. He brought back packs of Dominion infuser gel, human medfoam, filters, rations, one priceless converter brick that would turn Dominion capacitors into something the human kettle could sip. He brought back wounds. He brought back stories of silence. Whenever he returned, Rikhal was there, nested in blankets and quiet lamps the way a campsite might nestle wherever wilderness allowed. The Khelt performed the rituals of his people as best he could without legs. He carved little memory grooves along the edge of the stone under his hand. The grooves told the story of the last hours of a Khelt's life. He carved them with a solder tip because it was what Maddox had. He carved them thin and careful. When Maddox asked him what he was writing, Rikhal said, "My breath so it knows the way back." And Maddox let that be a poetry he did not try to translate. The coalition had called the Khelt heartless. The scraps of ritual and the quiet seriousness with which Rikhal counted each lamplight and each spoon of gel forced Maddox to admit the word had been convenient more than accurate. He had killed a great many Khelt. He had not thought them small. He had thought them large in the way of machines. Now he knew they were large in the way of people. The day the raiders came on skids with rusted prow spikes and banners full of other people's symbols, Maddox had been gone 7 hours and 43 minutes according to the stubborn little wind-up he now wore like a sacrament. He saw their wake from the ridge, dust plumes, the glitter of solar sail fragments repurposed into armor, the angry little lines of heat their engines wrote on the ground. He saw where they were heading. There were not many places left to plunder. He ran. He didn't make it. Not in time. By the time he reached the bunker, 2 of the skids were braced against its mouth, and 6 raiders in mismatched plates had vanished inside, their voices hard and high and eager. He should have waited. He did not. He went in low and silent and used the last virtue he had not spent yet, surprise. The first raider died without understanding that anyone had come to get him. The second turned and fired wild. Plasma splashed the walls and scorched Maddox's shoulder like the touch of an impatient god. The third had time to shout before his throat turned to steam. What followed was short, ugly work. Maddox had done ugly work before. He did it because the alternative was a corpse under blankets. He found Rikhal in the back room, half out of his blankets, one arm braced against the floor, a Dominion pulse pistol welded into the base of the med station and cabled into the Khelt's chest harness. He had made himself into a tripod, arm, chest cable, pistol. 3 of the raiders lay around him in shapes that did not look like anyone's body. Rikhal's breath came like the last winds of a long winter. He looked at Maddox, and this time he smiled with his eyes, which was what his face had to offer. "You took long," he said. "There were complications," Maddox said, grimacing as his shoulder protested the movement of holstering a knife. "Your blood is on my floor," Rikhal said. "This is an untidy house." Maddox barked one quick laugh and then swayed, grabbed a shelf that had no more interest in remaining attached to a wall, and went down with it in a clatter that would have alerted an army were there one left to alert. He woke under the ugly light of the med station with a cold feeling of blue in his veins. Rikhal had a hand on a lever and his eyes were careful. "Dominion serum," the Khelt said. "It does not know your blood. I convinced it. Do not thank me yet." Maddox did not thank him. He spared the breath to say, "I'm not dying in this room." "No," Rikhal said in a tone that brokered no disagreement. "You are not dying in this room." They had to move after that. The raiders were never alone, and their skids bore comm arrays that would tell more skids where their dead lay. Maddox stripped the bunker of anything they could not spare and built a sled with shock absorbers out of a gutted drone chariot. He padded its bed with textiles he didn't want to know the origin of, and fitted Rikhal into it like equipment, which offended both of them equally and could not be helped. He bolted rail plates to the sled's belly and set a hunter-seeker mine under its nose that would chase anyone who tried to pull it. He did it because he had to leave the sled sometimes, and because he needed to teach the world to bleed if it touched what was his. They went out into the city like that, a man and a paralyzed alien and a sled that rang like a quiet bell when it bumped the ribs of ruins. They traveled by night and by ash dawn and rested in forgotten culverts, in the shadows of downed carriers, in the skeleton of a tower whose elevator shaft opened onto a view of the dead harbor. Maddox learned the high path across the broken viaducts where the ash didn't pool. He learned to read the sky. The storms wrote in it if you paid attention. He learned to hum a little when the wind pressed too hard at his thoughts, and Rikhal learned to close his eyes and listen because the human hum kept fear at bay the way ritual used to. They had a destination that was less a place and more an idea, a Dominion uplink station on the city's far edge that might have survived by accident or stubbornness or both. From it, if its bones held, they could reach ships. Not human ships, those were gone, but any ships. Salvagers would be listening, so would the opportunists. So would the ones who came when there was duty, not profit. Maddox told himself the channel he opened would let the coalition know he was alive. He told himself other things he could not tell Rikhal in a voice that expected to be believed. Along the way, the world made sure they earned every meter. There was a night when the ash fog thickened into something that knew the shape of lungs and wanted to taste them. Maddox sealed their little camp and watched that fog curl around the door like it had fingers. There was a day when a section of elevated road decided it had had enough of pretending to be solid and fell. He dove under the sled and wrapped his arms around Rikhal and felt the sky break on his back. There was a morning when 3 Khelt drones, ragged and wild, set to fight anything that moved, came buzzing like hornets. Rikhal spoke to them in a voice he had to reach down inside himself to find, the voice of a captain whose commands used to move regiments. The drones flinched in the air, wavered, and then came to rest in a slow circle around the sled like dogs that had found their pack again. He sent them out as guards, and their tiny bodies drew a perimeter Maddox could trust. The drones called other things to them. One came at dusk, a Khelt, not Dominion by armor, no armor at all, just scraps, and not Vanguard by the ragged way he moved. He was not alone. 3 more followed with cautious steps and eyes that did not hold soldier stillness. Refugees, then, or deserters, or those emptied by grief. They saw the sled and the man and the one they had been taught to salute in another life. The leader went to one knee and lowered his head so the memory crown at his temple scraped ash. "Captain," the leader said in their own tongue, which came to Maddox through the bead like a song slowed to sorrow. "We thought you Ash." "Not Ash," Rikhal said, and his voice had that old iron in it again. "Wait, carried. They came with them for a time. They brought stories of other streets and the shape of the new dead. They corrected Maddox when he moved wrong and taught him where the city's skeleton still held after the fires. 2 nights, 6 extra hands made the difference between a meal and a hunger. On the 3rd, the refugees were gone by dawn, and Maddox found a little notch carved on the rail of the sled, a memory groove for a debt paid. He did not tell Rikhal he traced the groove with one finger until the dust on it smeared. The uplink tower was a shard of black glass against a sky that had decided to be the color of old steel. It had been elegant once. Now it was a knife. Maddox climbed it only after he made sure the tower's shadow held the sled in a pocket where raiders would not look first. He attached Rikhal's pistol harness to the sled's frame so the Khelt could pivot it with the strength left in his arm. He set 2 grenades in a place he labeled Plan B in his head and Last Thing in his heart. Then he climbed with a coil of fiber line, and a pack of transmitters that had not been meant to mate with Dominion architecture and would have to learn to love it fast. The climb took him back to other heights. The side of a refinery on Vesta Roman 4 with a wind full of oil, the skeletal ribcage of a shipyard in valleys where he had hung like a spider, and listened to men he would kill walk beneath him talking about the price of sugar. He had never loved heights, but he had learned how to move inside them so his fear didn't matter. He found purchase where there shouldn't be any. He wedged hands into arrow slits. He jammed the fiber line into cracks with his knees. He talked to the tower the way you talk to an animal you're riding over a stream that spooks it. Good old girl, he muttered when the wind shoved and the plate he hugged held. Good queen, hold on. At the top he found blackened panels that had once been skin. He scraped an access. The tower shuddered like an animal woken by the taste of its own blood. He wired the human transmitter into the Dominion belly, wedded wrong parts with tape and hope. He sent out a pulse in 3 languages, Coalition Code, General Salvage Band, and the old Khelt pitch that meant Captain Alive. He did it because desperation had no pride. He did it because silence had eaten too much of him already. The pulse went out in a widening ripple that made the air ring. Maddox closed his eyes and counted to 30 because that had been the ritual when you were a kid. And if you reached 30 without hearing your name, you gritted your teeth and made up a game so you could pretend you had not lost. On 27, his transmitter clicked. On 29, it said a word that had weight in it. Coalition. He swallowed a sound that was not entirely pain. This is Sergeant Cole Maddox, 1st Expeditionary. The voice cut in, formal and flat and precise. Identify encryption key. He had no key. He gave them his blood type and the names of everyone in his last unit and the serial number of the rifle he had bled on and the color of the sky over Lagos the week before the war. He gave them the things men carry when orders are ash. The voice paused long enough that he could hear his heart in his ears, then said, "Copy, hold position, retrieval ETA unknown." Unknown could be a word that meant hours. It could mean never. He did not ask. He turned his face to the wind and let it peel some of the tightness from his skin. On his second breath, the tower shivered again, but not with the echo of his call. He looked up and saw the sky. They looked like rain at first. A line of dots coming in from the dark under the planet's slow ring, each bright at the core and hazy at the edge. Dozens, then hundreds. Maddox's HUD, long dead, could not help him. His meat eyes did what they could. The dots became spears of light that left small scrapes of warmth on his face. The spears became bodies with gaping mouths and feathery edges. They had no angles, just curves. Their fronts weren't fronts. They were everywhere faces. He knew them without wanting to. Valleys had taught him. Riyadh had taught him. Ships had gone out in fire and men had come back different. The galaxy had named these things harrowers because they scraped a world until it remembered nothing but lines. They were not with the Dominion. They were not with the Coalition. They were of the war because war made openings and they were what poured through. They ate power. They ate metal. They ate the delicate mathematics that let machines mean something. And they loved a tower like a home. Maddox had time to say, very low, no, because his heart needed to hear him deny what his eyes saw. Then he slid down the fiber line so fast he burned his hands through the gloves and hit the ground with his knees in a way his knees would tell him about for a year if they got that long. Harrowers, he said to Rick Hall, because the Khelt would understand that word where 10 others failed. Rick Hall's eyes shuddered and opened. He pulled from somewhere the old captain's voice again, cool enough to set steel. Then we do not shine, he said. We darken, they come hungry for light. Maddox killed the sled lamps with a slap. He stripped his transmitter and hurled it into a culvert to die where nobody would see. The tower above them, beautiful, wrong, a beacon, sang to the harrowers. He had built a fire in cold space, and now the things that lived on fire were coming. He did not think regret would help him. He thought about angles. He thought about how long a man could move with a paralyzed alien on a sled under a sky that would soon mother a swarm. He was moving before the harrowers reached the tower, hauling the sled out of the shadow that had just become a target and into a loading tunnel that spiraled down like the inside of a seashell. The Khelt drones zipped above them in a tight little school, angry and precise. Khelt reached out with one arm and braced the pistol mount against a strut. The other arm lay useless over his chest, the nerves below dead. Maddox dragged and the sled's shocks did as they were meant to, and still they bounced hard enough that his teeth clacked. They went downward because down was the only direction that had walls thick enough to matter. The harrowers hit the tower like rain on a roof that remembers it is old. The sound was soft and remorseless. The tower's skin failed in acres. Harrowers folded themselves into its bones, turned everything electrical into soup, ate the field lacings like you eat a fruit you've waited too long to bite. Lights went out in sections. This gave them, Maddox counted without deciding to, 30 seconds between waves in which the harrowers would pause, sated, and the next line would find them. He picked a side passage at random and found that fate is sometimes kind to fools. The passage ended on a maintenance deck that hung over a void full of old machinery that had once lifted cargo up to the sky. The deck's far edge had come loose. It tilted like the lip of a bowl. At the bottom of the bowl lay a maintenance rail that dove into a tunnel too narrow for a harrower to love. "Rail skiff," Khelt said, reading the dead signage, tasting the word with a voice that remembered ships. "It took workers. Small. We are smaller." Maddox dropped to his knees at the edge of the deck and peered down. A skiff lay there like a broken tooth. Its running lights were dead, but its little coil could still be coaxed. He tied the fiber line to the sled, sank the other end into a crack with a piton, braced, and slid down arm over arm until his biceps burned and the bones at his elbow threatened to carry little poems about betrayal. He reached the skiff and thumbed its panel and flinched when it buzzed once like a bee asking if it still existed. "It lives," he called up, voice smaller than he liked in the big room. He hauled Khelt down by increments, the sled singing angry against the rail. The drones circled like anxious swallows. Somewhere above him the harrowers were changing strategies. The sound of eating had become a sound like thinking. He hated that the creatures thought. He had killed things whose thoughts were simple. They were easier. He got Khelt into the skiff with a roll and a push, and an apology that the Khelt did not demand but accepted because the movement cut new lines of pain across his face. Maddox slotted himself into the pilot cradle, which had been made for being with longer arms and 3 or 4 fewer scrapes. He thumbed power and felt the coil shiver and wake, and asked the rail who it was. The rail tolerated the question and answered with a low hum. They launched. The skiff bit the rail with a rubber kiss and slid down into a tunnel that remembered how to be a throat. Behind them, the maintenance deck cracked like ice and fell into its own room. The sound reached them as a soft thump and then a long hush. The harrowers did not like to go down. There was too little to eat in rock, but they would if they were hungry enough. Maddox slumped low in the cradle and let the skiff do what it had been born to do: flee. The tunnel breathed stale air at them that tasted like the inside of a machine that had coughed. It curved in a gradual arc that told Maddox some engineer had loved the idea of not throwing workers out of their seats every shift. It passed through nodes where lights failed and came back, and showed them graffiti in 6 languages pried off with knives. The Khelt drones rode the cable chase, their tiny bodies throwing little shadows on the skiff's nose that looked like the ghosts of birds. When they burst out into the open again, they were in the city's lower gut where river had once run and then been bottled, and then war had shattered the bottle. The riverbed was a highway now for machines that weren't meant to ride it. The things that did ride it were scavengers who had been brave enough to live under towers. The harrowers like towers. They were arriving en masse now, and the tower district was a bright rain. The riverbed would be dark for a while. The way in front of the skiff lay like a closed mouth. Maddox grinned at the absence of teeth and pushed the coil into a scream. The skiff ate distance. They did not outrun the war. No one outruns the war. But they went somewhere the war noticed late. That was enough to give them the space to make a new plan, which is often what survival is. The time between last plan and next. The new plan was stupid, which in Maddox's experience meant it would work because the world did not plan on stupidity. They would take the riverbed to the outer pumps. Beyond those lay a field of glass that used to be farms. Beyond that, the shipyard. The shipyard had machines that could talk to ships because that was its reason to be. Those machines would be harrower candy, but perhaps the yard's drowned dockhouse, built low, built thick, still kept one transmitter's skeleton safe. If so, Maddox would wake it and whisper into it and stretch hope long enough to wrap around something that could fly. They made the pumps by dusk, a landscape of cylinders and pipes like a forest that had decided geometry was better than leaves. The skiff whined and sat, and Maddox led it, because you owe engines the courtesy of rest when they have carried your weight beyond their patience. He scouted, quick and quiet, with a knife and a length of line and a flare he hated to light. He found 3 bodies that had been raiders not so long ago, which meant there were other things hunting that liked raiders less than he did. He found footprints he did not recognize, and decided he did not need to meet the feet that had made them. He found a maintenance shed that still had a door that still latched. He rolled Rickall into it and set the drones to a perimeter, and watched the Khelt try not to shake in the aftermath of being moved too far too fast. In the night, Rickall told him a story softly in the old captain's cadence, so that it felt like a column moving through darkness at orders. He told Maddox about a boy on a moon where the mountains were blue, because the rocks were full of metals that sang when you struck them. He told him about how that boy had stood in front of a teacher with a memory crown that shone a little more than the others and had said, "I do not kneel," when asked to copy the oath like everyone else. He told him about punishment and about the pride that had tasted like rust, and about the moment decades later when he had knelt in mud next to a dying enemy and realized the world does not end with kneeling. Sometimes it begins. "You knelt?" Maddox asked, because he could not keep himself from imagining it. The Khelt's body did not suit the word. "Not like you kneel," Rickall said with a faint ghost of humor. "But yes. I lowered my crest. I placed my hand in the mud he died in. I asked his name. He did not give it. He said, 'Leave me.' I said, 'I will sit.' He said, 'Then we will die here, both of us.' I said, 'Then we will die here, both of us.' He laughed. His laugh tasted like iron. He died. I carried his weight." Maddox closed his eyes and saw the boy who had refused the oath and the man who had made a different one in a field he did not own. He opened them and looked at the sled and the pistol welded to the med station and the drones that watched the door and the world outside that never truly slept. "I don't know if I'm kneeling," he said, "but I'm here." "That is kneeling," Rickall said. In the morning, the pumps wore a crown of frost that glittered in the weak sunlight like jewels in a cheap shop window. Maddox broke the frost with his hand, and the way it snapped felt like victory. They moved out into the field the bombardments had turned to glass. The skiff ground its nose on the first ridge and complained like an old man. The coil hated the glass. The glass hated the coil. They made a pact. 2 bodies would break and the third would move anyway. Halfway across the field, the air went cold in a way that meant physics had taken its hands off the wheel. Maddox looked up and saw trickles of harrower light in the sky like fireflies that had never learned how to be gentle. The creatures were scouting the fortification line the Dominion had built out here once. Plates of stacked ceramic meant to eat enemy fire until there were no enemies. Now the plates lay like steps toward a sky that had no stairs. The harrowers drifted down to taste them. They did not like ceramic very much. They liked the machine nerves that ran between the plates better. They drank those quickly and moved on in a slow wave that took them toward the shipyard. It could have been a blessing. They were going where Maddox wanted to go. It could have been a sentence, because following a harrow or wave into a place full of machines is what you do right before you write someone's last line. He took the skiff toward the yard slowly, like approaching a sleeping cat you had once known when it was a kitten. The yard rose out of the glass like a rectangle that had grown tired of pretending it wasn't a fort. Its cranes had bent under heat and sat like the spines of gigantic animals that had lied down to die. The outer fence had been eaten long ago. The dock houses were heavy and black, and some still had roofs. He picked the one with a roof that looked like it had opinions about the world. He slid the skiff in through a door built for something larger, and the dark inside wrapped around them like a cloak. It smelled of oil and time. It smelled like a place that had told men lies about safety, and then kept those lies half-true long enough that it owed them apologies. He set the skiff to idle low, helped Rikhal sit up a fraction because the Khelt's back had begun to protest the constant angle, and went hunting for the spindle of a transmitter. He found it in a corner behind a tarp that had once been green. The spindle rose like a spine built by a sculptor who loved anatomy too much. It had been damaged but not ruined, and its soul, the delicate filament lattice at the core, had been spared the worst of the fires. He took it apart gently with hands that liked to break things and woke it like a man wakes his child, softly with an ear for breath. When the filament glowed the color of old honey, he spoke into the room and hoped it would make the words small enough to carry. He spoke coalition. He spoke salvage. He spoke the Khelt pitch. He said his name again because saying your name sometimes keeps you from disappearing. He said paralyzed Khelt Vanguard Captain alive, and he said it like a dare because there were ears in the universe that heard Khelt alive and began to want. The answer came from two places almost at once. One was a crackle of coalition signal, a voice that belonged to comms and chain of command and all the things men build to keep themselves from falling in pieces. Maddox, this is Task Group Kennicott. We read you. Your beacon doesn't match your theater. Verify. Verify me later, he said, and gave them coordinates and described the way the glass field broke under weight so they wouldn't send a lander that thought physics liked it. The voice, cool, taught with the fiscal cruelty of a man who had lost people too and didn't have room for surprise, said, hold position, and he said, sure. The other answer was a different tone entirely, silk shot through with gravel, not pirate, worse, professional. Independent extraction crew Kestrel responding to call, it said, we'll be on site in 20, payment negotiable. Negative, Maddox said, because he had learned that one when he was a child and it had grown hooks. We've got coalition coming. Stand down. Good. They can buy him from us, the gravel silk said, too friendly to be anything but a threat. He killed the line and breathed. He didn't tell Rikhal about the Kestrel. He let the Khelt rest with his eyes half closed and his hand on the pistol's grip like the memory of holding a sword. He walked the interior of the dock house 3 times to make his feet draw the map his mind would use later in a hurry. He set the 2 grenades where they would do the least damage to the transmitter and the most damage to anything with a name. He asked the drones to show him their eyes and saw through them a yard that lay under a sky full of lazy predators. He heard the skids before he saw them. The Kestrel were not shy. They came in painted in a color that had once been white and was now the color of smugness. Their engines sang. Their crew wore gear that said they had never lost a man and had never expected to. They fanned out with a salt grace that made him want to shoot them just to adjust their understanding of the world. At their head walked a woman whose armor had a black bird stenciled on the chest. Her face was human in the way the coast is human. It had cliffs that said falling would be interesting and not particularly tragic. Sergeant Maddox, she said, her voice pure gravel silk in air now. "Thank you for making our day more profitable." "You're late to the party," he said, stepping into the doorway where his silhouette made a target his rifle could punish anyone for taking. "Coalition has dibs. Coalition has opinions," she said. "I have a contract with a very interested buyer who likes their war trophies conscious. Now hand me your invalid." "He's a captain," Maddox said. He did not add "and my friend" because that would have sounded like something his enemies could use. She smiled without bothering to put it in her eyes. "He's currency." He did not answer. He just let the silence show its teeth. It took a breath, too. He counted small things, the angle of the woman's sidearm, the way the man at her left wore his weight on his heels, the location of the drones above. "You're outnumbered," she said, her tone patient now. One professional trying to talk another down from the tree both of them knew was on fire. "You're outgunned. Your coalition friends might come, but I will be gone with the package before your chain of command finishes, confirming your mother's maiden name." "You won't," Maddox said, and he believed it. He did not know why until he looked beyond the woman's head and saw the sky move. The harrowers had grown bored of the tower. They were drifting toward the shipyard in a line that had decided it was a hand. The hand opened over the cranes and closed again. Lights went out across the yard like someone had swallowed stars. The Kestrel crew saw it too. Their confidence did something delicate around the edges. "You brought the wrong mouths," he said softly. Gravel Silk glanced up, glanced back, and made a decision fast enough that Maddox respected it even as he hated it. "New plan," she said to her people. "We take them both and get under rock. Move." Maddox detonated the first grenade. It exploded behind them in a shower of ceramic dust and twisted rebar and artificial thunder that made everyone's ears ring and nobody's eyes blind because he had chosen the angle. The Kestrel flinched purely human. He didn't shoot. He ran back into the dockhouse, because there are moments when courage is a straight line and moments when courage looks like retreat. He got to the sled in 3 steps that very much felt like 10. Rick Hall was half-propped like a man ready to watch God arrive and see if his old prayers had life in them. "Coalition?" the Khelt asked, which was the cruelest joke the day had made yet without meaning to be. "Complications," Maddox said. "Harrowers, also capitalists." Rick Hall's mandibles flexed in something that might have been dismay or laughter. "Shall we kneel?" "We will sit," Maddox said, and smiled because pain likes laughter even when it is not funny. He wheeled the sled toward the back of the dockhouse where a service tunnel darkened into suggestion. The drones parted the shadows for them. He heard the Kestrel coming like storm water in a narrow street. He pulled the second grenade and thought about how few things he had left that could change the shape of a room. He triggered it halfway down the tunnel. It didn't explode so much as push. The push knocked the supports they would not need anymore in the direction he liked. The ceiling came down behind them in a messy cough. Dust rolled forward and kissed his neck. Silence followed with its quiet, pleased little smile. He got them into a sump where the dockhouse drowned itself when storms were too much. He set the sled against a wall that hairs remembered moisture and made it breathe again. Above, the harrowers began to dine on the yard. The sounds they made were wet and patient. He listened. He imagined them tasting condensation lines and cables, turning light into something bright inside that had no eyes. It took the Kestrel 3 minutes to breach where he had dropped the ceiling, which was long enough for the Coalition signal to return with a vector, and an ETA that had numbers he could breathe with. "Hold," they said. He made a noise that acknowledged them without promising to be alive when they arrived. He set his rifle over the sled's nose. He counted in reverse from a number that had felt lucky once in a dice game in a port he could not name now without tasting pepper and regret. When the Kestrel came through, they did it beautifully. Clean arcs, good spacing, no one forgetting to watch behind. They stepped into the sump like it belonged to them the way people do when they've taught the world to confirm their taste. The woman in front took in the sled, the man in front of it, the pistol mounted where no pistol belonged, the drones that hovered like punctuation. She nodded in honest respect. "You keep making this expensive," she said. "You keep running your mouth," Maddox said. And then the harrowers poured in because the universe has timing and it loves comedy. They did not pour like water. They made the wall fail as if it had decided to become a curtain. They came in low in a way that said they had learned this shape for this space, which was unkind of them. Light bled across their skins like fish turning in a current. The kestrel shouted. They had EMPs because of course they did. They threw them and the EMPs pulsed and the harrowers slowed and then decided they liked that feeling and moved into it the way you move into warm water after a cold day. The kestrel fired and their rounds chewed shining holes that closed like wounds. Deciding surgery was an opinion. Maddox fired. His shots took little licks of light to death. Rickal's pistol spoke in sharp syllables. It spoke Dominion grammar. The harrowers did not care about grammar, but they paused to hear it because there was power in old weapons told to sing like that. The fight reminded him of a sandstorm he had seen once on Mars. You can kill grains as they fly into your teeth, but the wind will throw you more. What you do is hunker and decide to still be there when the wind gets bored. He made himself small in the ways that counted. He shot. He pulled the sled back a hair. He let the drones tangle themselves in the harrower edges and sacrifice their tiny lives to give him half a breath. He saw the kestrel leader plant her feet like a prayer and fire with economy, and saw the way her eyes tracked the things and understood she had never thought she would meet them, and now she would die in their mouth, and hated that he realized he did not want that for her. "Left," he said, "for no reason but the human one that hates to let competence die stupid." He shot the thing on her left the moment her head turned. It fell in light. She killed its sibling with a shot that started where his ended. For a heartbeat, a line hung in the air between them that could have been comradeship if the world were kinder. Then the roof above their sump gave a sound and everything became simple again. Get under, get out, get small. He pushed the sled toward a drain whose grate had been pried off by men with better tools and less time. It was small. The sled was not. He kicked the sled until it agreed to be water. It flowed. He followed it with skin and swears. Behind, the kestrel fought. Some of them followed. He did not count. Numbers would not help. The drain dumped them into a culvert that smelled older than war. It sloped down and away and then leveled and then offered them a door that had the shape of escape when you squinted. He shouldered it, and it went with a grunt and a little scream that said it had been married to that wall a long time and did not consent. He apologized to the air and pulled the sled into a room where long-dead pumps sat like altars in a church that had forgotten what worship meant. They stayed there until the sounds outside changed into quiet that might mean victory and might mean we have devoured enough for now. Then the coalition came like thunder disciplined into a spear. Dropships with keels stained by other planets dropped in low and mean, and disgorged men and women who moved like orders had crawled inside their skeleton and made a home. Their insignia wore dust already. Their faces were the sort you learn to trust or hate depending on which side you stand on. They found Maddox and the sled and the alien. They put circles of weapons around the room like walls. Their leader stepped forward, young, a scar still pink because it did not belong to this planet. He looked at Maddox's face and then at the man in the sled. "Sergeant," he said, and there was a world in the word, mostly question and a little pride. "You made a friend." "Captain Rickal Teven of the Dominion Vanguard," Maddox said because the words were an act and he wanted to practice what sort of man he was. "He cannot walk. He will not be taken." "That's complicated," the young leader said. "We have orders." "So do I," Maddox said, They held each other's eyes long enough that both of them understood there were histories pressing at their ribs like children with sticky hands, asking to be let out. The young leader glanced at his second, who wore the expression of a woman trying to add new numbers on a broken abacus. Coalition law regarding Dominion wounded allows for medical intervention and internment, Maddox said, because he had read the briefings that were meant to make men feel moral about cages. Not sale, not trophy, not execution, he's not cargo. We don't shoot invalids, the young leader said, insulted, and Maddox believed him. But the council can argue about my discharge later, Maddox said, and felt his mouth make a shape it had not made since he was 18, and telling his father he was going to leave his small life for a bigger, harder one. If you try to put a bag over his head in this room, you'll fight me first. There is a sort of silence groups of soldiers make when they are deciding whether to laugh or to find cover. The room made that silence. The young leader let it sit a second and then tilted his head slightly, which might have meant respect if he lived to tell that version. Load them, he said to his people. We'll sort it on the ship. On the ship, everything smelled like mopped metal and old coffee. Rickall hated the gravity which had been built for humans and not whatever arrangement of weight the Khelt had been born to. He lay very still and watched the ceiling with predator calm. Maddox sat beside the sled and pretended to rest. The young leader came to stroke the silence and throw words into it like seeds. The kestrel got bitten, he said. Some got away. Their bird makes a loud noise when it's hurt. Good, Maddox said, and meant it with a purity that surprised him. You'll be debriefed until the stars get bored, the young leader said. They might court-martial you for desertion of post and other sins. They might pin a medal on you on vid and forget about you in a week. I don't know. I haven't decided if I'm testifying. You will, Maddox said, and watched the way the young leader's face fought a grin because he had recognized an older man telling him his future the way older men do when they have won the right to act tired in public. What are we calling this? The leader asked, softer now. Rescue, kidnapping, debt, Maddox said, and felt the word way right. On the third day aboard, the council called. Their faces hung in the air like moons, small and full of opinions. They asked him why, as if the word held anything but what he had left. He told them the truth, because lies are for the guilty and the fearful, and he felt both but did not care. He told them he had heard a voice carry weight and he had leaned, and he had refused to let the universe be as cruel as it wanted to be. He told them if they wanted to jail him he would go, because duty had two hands, and one of them was iron. He told them if they wanted to kill him he would kneel, because there was a thing to kneel to now that made sense. A man he had saved and had been saved by in turn. They did not kill him. The galaxy has too much paperwork for impulsive executions. They did not throw a parade. The coalition washed him through inquiry rooms and stamped him with words like insubordinate and unreliable, and in possession of unregistered moral clarity. They stripped him of a stripe and then, by someone else's hand months later, pinned a pin no one would ever see under armor. He took both with the same face because neither would change the day he had already lived. Rickall did not go to a cage. He went to a room with very small windows and clinicians who watched his blood as if it were a story with a twist. They asked him questions that were not questions, probings disguised as care. He answered the ones that tasted like medicine, ignored the ones that tasted like war, and when they tried to make him an object, he reminded them by the angle of his head that objects do not look back. They could not grow him new legs. Dominion medicine shaped different wounds than human doctors understood. The med station on Lorncaw had done what could be done. The rest was a choice, endure or erase. He was offered the kindness of chemical fog. He refused it in a way that made young clinicians straighten as if the air had cooled. He asked for a blade, not to use, just to hold. Maddox brought him one, a human knife with a black grip and a nicked edge that had opened 1,000 boxes before it had decided it wanted a bigger life. Rickal held it like a promise. He traced on its flat reflection the outline of a crest he had worn once when he had walked into rooms and made them quiet. He set the blade on his chest like a book he meant to finish. They spoke, in the spaces between tests, about little things that anchored big ones. Food that had tasted like home once and no longer did after war. A river each had known. The way dust sounds under boots when it's the dust of ground bones. They traded stories the way soldiers do, one for one, until they had built between them a bridge that held even on bad days. The coalition did not like to be made to feel in public that their enemies were people, but the story got out anyway because stories leak where orders try to hold. A medic told a friend who whispered into a mic which carried the words farther than any of them intended. The net turned the corners of 1,000 mouths. Someone drew a picture, a human hauling a sled under a sky that had broken, an alien lying on it with his hand on an old knife. It caught. A mother in a mining town sent a note that said a human had held her daughter's hand once while she bled, and now she was repaying the weight. A Khelt child on a neutral station whose parents had shown him no clouds ever sent a crude little vid of himself lowering his crest and saying a word that roughly meant seen. The council frowned. The council could not make a universe where the story had not happened. They settled for being angry in ways that sounded like caution. There were those who hated it loud, families who had lived under the dominion and lost fathers to slavery and mines. Maddox listened to them and did not turn away. He did not ask them to forgive. He did not offer arguments about larger pictures and geopolitical compassion. He said, "I carried a weight." He said, "I would not have left yours," and he meant it, and some of them believed him because belief is strange and personal and maps onto faces, not ideas. Months later, the war moved somewhere else because it always does. The way a forest fire will jump the brake if the wind is wrong. Maddox could have been rotated home then. He wasn't. He requested assignment to the ship that had carried him and Rickal out of Lorne Ka. He went back into the black and stood on a deck that hummed like a heart while men and women walked around him with maps in their eyes. He did not become famous. He did not become the man who had changed policy. He became the man who checked seals twice and lifted the heavy end and remembered to bring extra batteries. Rickal became something else, something the Dominion had made no word for, an elder both to his own people and to those who had been enemies. He spoke in rooms where no Khelt voice had been invited, and he did it without raising his crest. He told the story of a city that had become bones and a human who had refused to accept the way the galaxy sorted things into piles. He left out details that would make the story smaller. He was careful with its edges. He did not forgive the Dominion. He did not condemn them in the way men and women from outside asked him to so that they could pin his words to other arguments. He simply testified, breath, weight, knife. There were attempts. The Kestrel carried grudges like coins. Others bore pride that could not tolerate the idea of a captain who breathed, because an enemy had said no to gravity. A knife came once as a gift that hid a transmit needle that would have turned his blood into a flare others could follow. He held the knife by its blade and looked at the giver until the man decided to remember another appointment. A saboteur got as far as the outer door one night before a drone, one of a new clutch, built in a coalition bay out of parts old and parts new, trained on Rickal's single command, turned itself into shrapnel in a doorway, and wrote a white scar on the man's thigh that would make him limp until he died. Maddox slept light and woke to the sound of bad decisions. He taught a few people what it feels like to run into a wall you had not expected to be there. He took a shot meant for Rickal one morning in a corridor where the coffee was bad and the light worse, and the taste of oil came back to his mouth as he went down. He woke under blue light again and stared at a ceiling and thought, "I do not want to die looking up." And then he felt a hand on his arm, light and heavy at once, and turned his head to see the Khelt watching him with eyes that had learned all the human words for worry. "I carry your weight," Khelt said. "Yeah," Maddox said, even though speech felt like hoisting a bag full of rocks up a ladder. "We can set it down for a bit." "Not yet," Khelt said. "The war ended the way wars always end, not with a moment but with a drift, as if the river that had been raging decided to remember it was supposed to be a lake. Papers were signed by hands that had never held rifles. Ships changed direction and painted over emblems. Men went home and learned that homes are different if you take too long to get to them. The Dominion fell not with a bang but with fracture lines that had lived in it for a century. 100 small states grew in the cracks. Some were good, some were not. The coalition called it victory because they had to file their reports under something. Khelt did not have a state to go home to. He had friends in odd places. A docking bay in the Free Belt that hummed with songs in a language nobody bothered to translate because you don't translate songs. A research ward where a young clinician with too many pens in her hair argued with machines on his behalf, until they admitted he had a right to be comfortable. A little station on the edge of a dead nebula, where children of 3 species played a game with hoops that made no sense until you laughed, and then made all the sense in the world. Maddox went to Earth once and stood on a pier where gulls had learned to live with the smell of human. He watched dawn do its old trick with the air. He thought about calling someone. He let the urge pass. He had been awake too long. He went back out because out had his name on it and because there were still people to carry. Years after Lorncaw, they returned to its orbit because the coalition wanted to drop things into the old city and see if anything answered that shouldn't. The planet was quieter. The winds still remembered how to cut. The towers were lower where they hadn't been rebuilt. They made less of a meal for the sky. They landed for a day and walked the broken streets, and none of the ghosts asked them any questions. Maddox found the place where he had buried 2 banners, Dominion and his own, over a grave that had been more a promise than a truth. He put his hand on the ground and pushed just enough to make the dust carry a handprint. He did not have a prayer to say and did not make one. Khelt sat on the sled and watched him and nodded once in a way that meant both thanks and go on. On the way back to the ship, a child ran into their path and fell hard because the world ends that way for children sometimes, with a piece of stone that does not move when you ask it. Maddox scooped the kid up, and somebody's mother made sounds that were older than language. The child stared at Khelt with eyes that understood the shapes of war and did not yet have words for their edges. The child lowered his head without understanding why. Khelt lowered his crest as far as it would go. The air did a small thing you could have easily missed if you were late or cruel. It gentled. Later, on a night when the ship was a long silver whisper under a sky that had forgotten how to wound, Maddox sat with Khelt and watched the stars hold their breath. "Why didn't you take the fog?" he asked finally, softly, not as a demand, not as a test. He meant the chemical mercy. Khelt considered the knife on his chest and then the doorway and then the human face that had learned to be both flint and water. "Because I wanted to see," he said. "Even if all that was left to see was pain. Even if the last thing I saw would be an enemy who refused to be one." Maddox nodded. They let silence sit with them like a third person who did not need a chair. Somewhere in the ship a pipe ticked. Somewhere in the universe a man decided not to pull a trigger and a woman decided to, and neither knew the other existed. They were called to testify again, years after anyone who mattered could be persuaded to care. A tribunal wanted to codify behavior for the next war, as if you can teach men and women how to be brave by writing a sentence and stamping it. The room had better coffee than last time. The walls had screens that showed noble things. They asked Maddox if saving an enemy had made him an enemy of his own. He answered with fewer words than the ones they had prepared to argue with. He said, "I carried weight." He said, "We will need people who do that regardless of the emblem on the armor." They asked Rikhal if he forgave. He said, "I endure." The tribunal wrote things. The galaxy spun. Kestrel came back one last time like a summer storm that wants to be a hurricane and isn't. They tried to take Rikhal from a transit platform where Maddox had allowed himself to get bored. He learned again the old lesson. Never. The gravity there didn't quite match Earth's, and violence feels different when your guts float a little as you hit. The woman with the bird came with 5 men this time, and a smugness that had learned humility but not enough. "You've been hard to find," she said. "You've been easy to forget," Maddox said, and the fight that followed did not last long. The woman did not leave breathing. The last of the Kestrel crawled away and had to decide in a hospital later whether he wanted to live with the noises his sleep made. Maddox washed his hands with difficulty because blood dries stickier than you remember. Rikhal watched him and said nothing that made sound. Everything that needed saying hung like a flag between them, and the wind, for once, did not tear it. The last time, no, call it what it was, the latest time. They went to speak to children who had learned the war in holos and thought it was a game that ended with a horn. They told the truth as much as they could without teaching a lesson that would kill them young. They said the world is hard, and sometimes the right thing is a rock that cuts your fingers when you carry it. But you carry it anyway, because if you put it down, it will roll back and crush someone softer. They said enemies are easy until they are specific. They said bravery does not feel like bravery when you are using it. It feels like breath. A boy with a broken front tooth asked if Rikhal was a hero. Rikhal considered the shapes of words and chose a small one. "No," he said. "I am a man who did not stop. He nodded toward Maddox, is a man who refused to let me." The boy nodded solemnly as if he'd been handed a pebble and told it was a planet. He would find out later about scale. On some days, when the black felt too big, Maddox thought about death. He did not fear it. He feared dying stupid, dying late, dying in a way that undid something good. He feared mistakes he would not know he had made. When that thought tried to curl around his ribs and squeeze, he would look at Rikhal and see a face that did not smile easily but had learned to let the eyes say maybe. He built a small religion around that maybe, non-denominational, non-transferable, non-refundable. It did not keep him from harm. It kept him from despair, which is a different thing and uses different tools. And when the moments came, and they did come, when a choice opened in front of him like a door with teeth, he chose the way that hurt fullest and made the story truer. He pulled bodies from wrecks that had no reason to hold breath. He walked into rooms where he wasn't invited and left them having been necessary. He taught young soldiers how to read the sky. He taught them to hum when fear tried to draft them. He showed them a handprint pressed into Lorne Ka dust because sometimes you anchor yourself with something you can touch. He did not become gentle. He became exact. Rikhal learned a trick of the human tongue, sarcasm that did not wound. He used it sparsely, like spice, and the first time he deployed it on a bureaucrat with a stack of forms, the man blinked and then unexpectedly laughed. A door opened in a building that had not thought it needed one. Papers moved a little faster. It was not miracle. It was days' work. That is how the world shifts, in little ticks, an inch and a sigh. Years can pass like water under a bridge that has been repaired again and again. You stop noticing the creak, and then a day arrives that tastes like something old you haven't felt in your mouth in a while, metal and lightning and the careful rage of necessity. The galaxy had another war in it. It always does. Not as big, not as everywhere, big enough. The coalition called for men who would not count the cost first. Maddox put on armor that fit like it had been waiting on a hanger for his shape. Rikhal rolled into a command room where screens made white ghosts on faces and spoke in his captain's voice to people who never thought they would hear it and felt parts of themselves stand up and salute. When the ships burned and the sky went mean and the hand again reached down in the form of things that turned light into appetite, men and women who had heard a story about a sled under a broken tower did something small that mattered. They did not fire when an enemy lay heavy and still. They did not sell a man with a crest for parts. They carried weight. Not all of them. Enough. How do you measure enough? By the ones who lived that would not have. On a late evening in a quiet between storms, Maddox and Khelt sat in a cargo bay that smelled like the ghosts of ripe fruit. The ship hummed like a cat old enough to have opinions. The lights had decided to be soft. Maddox's hands bore new scars he did not plan to name. Khelt's knife lay flat on his chest, warmed by his breath. They looked out at the stripe of stars the window offered as if the universe were teaching them to write straight lines. "We will die," Khelt said, not as a threat, not as a prophecy, but as a man pointing out a landmark on a road they both walked. Maddox nodded. "Not today," he said, and the words did not feel brave or defiant. They felt habitual, like breath. "Not today," Khelt echoed, and the drone in the corner, sly and patient, let its little lights flicker approval like a dog thumping a tail once against the floor. Outside, the stars did what they had done before anyone named them. They endured. There is a sort of victory that does not get put on banners because it does not look good from a distance. It is two people who should have been dead at each other's hands sitting in a ship older than their grudges and choosing to wake up again tomorrow. It is saying, "I will carry your weight," to someone the math insists is not yours. It is refusing to give the universe what it expects, which is more hatred, more sorting, more efficiency. It is the long work, the one without trumpets, the one that looks like failure every day until suddenly it is a bridge others cross without thinking. When those children from the station with the hoop game grew tall enough to wear armor or lab coats or both, they did not think much about the story of a human and a Khelt under a broken tower. They thought about it the way you think about a song your mother hummed when the power went out. You do not decide to be changed by it, you find you have been. On Lorncaw, the wind still does what it always did because nothing teaches wind. It scrapes, it whispers. Sometimes it seems to say a name, sometimes it says two. The tower is gone now. The field of glass is less sharp because time is a great file. New plants grow in cracks that once were fire. If you kneel, and no one is watching so there is no cost, you can press your hand into the ground and the dust will take that print and keep it a while. Someone will find it and put their hand where yours was, and suddenly the universe will become specific to them in a way that changes how they carry it. There will be more wars. There will be more stupid moments where the right thing looks like a cliff, and you have to decide to jump. There will be more raiders and more men with birds on their chest who think profit is a leash they can throw around other people's throats. There will be more children whose teeth are not all in and whose eyes know too much. There will be more kneeling, and some of it will feel like the end of the world, and some of it will be its beginning. When they asked Maddox one last time, in a room with glass and leather and air that smelled like too much money trying to seem clean, why he had done it, he said a thing so simple it embarrassed the men who had prepared to argue with him. He said, "I heard someone refuse to die alone." He said, "I was there." He said that was enough. And when he died, which is not a tragedy and not a failure but the conclusion of a sentence he had been writing for a long time, he did not die looking up at a ceiling. He died doing what he had practiced. Exactness. He died with his hand on a sled that carried someone else through a doorway the world had tried to shut. Khelt outlived him by a year and a season, and built a small shrine that held a knife, and the first hum from the human's throat he had tried to mimic, and never fully mastered. He taught children how to hold hands steady when applying pressure to a wound. He refused a statue, and accepted a little plaque that read nothing like enough and therefore was perfect. Stories do not end in ways that satisfy everyone. They end the way weather does, by becoming another day. So this one becomes tomorrow. In that tomorrow, someone will debate policy, and someone will empty a bedpan, and someone will lower a crest, and someone will lift a rifle, and someone will decide mercy is worth the bruise it leaves on duty. In that tomorrow, a man will put his hand on a grave that is not his and say, "I see you," and the ground will warm beneath it as if in answer. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.